All right, as folks are coming in here, again, I want to welcome you all to our fourth and final webinar here in a series of online events that we've been hosting here at the After Party. The After Party is a project co-led by myself, my friend David French, and my friend Russell Moore, who is going to be joining us today to talk about how we can actually help pastors, people who are pastors, but also are pastors, move towards spiritual health here as we head into what is going to be a challenging 2024, undoubtedly. So I am joined now by my friend Russell Moore, who is a co-creator of the After Party. Russell, welcome, and I'm glad to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah, looking forward to it.
All right. I think we're going to just sort of get started here as people trickle in. Um, Let me set the stage here for what we're doing here today. We've said that we've had a number of webinars to help just people in general know how to move toward better Christian politics, especially by using this resource that we've created called the After Party. And just to refresh, the After Party is a 6-session video curriculum that Christians in churches, small groups, Sunday school, even also just with friends, family, or even individually can go through. Each session is about 60 to 90 minutes long. It's interactive, no prep is required, and it's designed to help Christians begin to talk, interact, and especially center their hearts on Jesus here as we move through a very political season. And it was so fun to create this with David and Russell. And we are doing these webinars as a way to introduce people to this resource and help them know how to best benefit from it. And this particular webinar, we really wanted to focus on pastors, and for a few reasons. One, because a lot of our audience are pastors. But two, even if you're listening to this now and you are not a pastor yourself, you are affected by your pastor. The biblical vision is your spiritual health is wrapped up in the spiritual health of your pastor. Jesus, has in scripture, we have a few specific things that Jesus taught us to pray for in addition to the Lord's Prayer. And one of them is in Matthew 9 when he says, pray for the people who are the workers in the harvest, people who are going to be caring and feeding for the spiritual well-being of the followers of Jesus. And Jesus seems to think that, boy, the spiritual well-being of the shepherds, the overseers, the elders, people who care for others is going to be something that if you're one of them, you really ought to pray for and be concerned about. And so that's really the conversation for today. I'm about to launch into that conversation with Russell, but if you are listening, please know that you can put your questions in the Q&A function that's right on the bottom of your Zoom screen there. You can start putting them in now, even as we are talking, and then our staff is going to be looking through those questions. And then in the sort of the second half of this webinar, Russell and I will be fielding those questions. And you can also look at other people's questions and upvote them so that we especially know, hey, this is a question we should be tackling. So you can do that at any time and starting now in that Q&A section. So let me introduce Russell now formally. Russell's formal job title is editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. Russell, here's my informal title for you. Um, I think of you as country doctor to America's pastors. So, those old-time country doctors who would be on horseback, itinerant, traveling around from region to region, and they would be the doctor for the sort of population spread far and flung. And I sort of view you as the country doctor to America's pastors because your travel schedule is nutty in terms of how far and wide across this country you travel to really care for and equip America's pastors. And so, as we head into 2024, if there's one person I wanted to ask, give me the diagnosis of the spiritual and an emotional state of America's pastors. You're the guy, you're the country doctor. So, from your travels, what's the diagnosis? How would you sum it up?
Well, I'm not legally allowed to prescribe tranquilizer in an election year, although there are many people who would like that. I think that we have a lot of pastors who are exhausted and many pastors who can't afford to admit that they're exhausted, because there are pastors who will say, if I admit just how exhausted I am post COVID, post political polarization, post everything, then it's going to alarm my people. And so I can't do that. And there are other pastors, I think, who don't know that they are exhausted. They're
Mm.
sort of been pressing through and don't realize some of the signs of really being worn down. And so that's one of the reasons why. I mean, I would say one thing when I'm talking to pastors, but another thing when I'm talking to lay people to say, really watch out for your pastor.
Mm.
Take care of your pastor and find ways to do that. And there are different ways to do that in different congregations, but it's important.
Say more, Russell, about why they're exhausted. Why, and this is borne out by not just by your anecdotal experience, but in statistics. The famous Barna study that shows 4 in 10 pastors are thinking about quitting. That number apparently has improved slightly in the last survey, but it's still pretty dire. And they do often cite exhaustion as one of them. So, but get underneath that, Russell. Why are they exhausted?
Well, part of it has to do with, I think, the way that social media has transformed the way that we interact with one another. And so, I mean, there are always going to be people in a congregation who are upset. There's always going to be that. I mean, I'm the grandson of a pastor who lived in a parsonage next to our church. That's been going on, First Timothy until now.
Right.
Uh, but there's something unique about the kinds of tactics that some people will use, and there's also something different about the kind of emotional temperature around us right now, and a lot of that does have to do with politics. So that you can have pastors. I'll have pastors in very different congregations in one day. I had the pastor, a very conservative evangelical pastor, as I am, but in a very, very conservative congregation, and a very progressive pastor in a very progressive congregation who who both were having the exact same experience. Even though the two churches could not be more different in terms of their political views, but there's an insistence not only that the pastor reflect back the political views of that segment of the congregation, but that they make central whatever political views that segment finds to be central, and that's an impossible task. And so that's part of what wears it down. And then you add to it the way that politics has come to take on this almost talismanic sort of function in American life. I was just talking to a young man the other day who said that his best friend said to him for his first vote, he's old enough to vote this year, and his best friend said, "If you don't vote the way that I think you should vote, I'm not sure we can be friends anymore
Wow.
because I think I will have lost respect for you." And I said, what you may not realize is that's a really unusual thing in American life. I mean, people weren't doing that with Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower, or even with George W. Bush and John Kerry.
Yeah.
So we're in a particularly different sort of time, and that adds to the stress of it all.
Right, because you imagine then what that must do for the relationship between a pastor, their congregation, where a congregation then maybe even split themselves. They're going to be split with each other because they're eyeing one another and thinking, is the person in the next pew somebody that voted the same way I did? And if not, can I still remain in fellowship with them? And then both of them are turning their gaze onto the pulpit and thinking, what is the pastor voting? And can I remain still in this church? My gosh, that's in a very untenable situation, isn't it, Russell?
Well, and it's not just that. It's true even in a congregation in which everyone voted the same way,
Mm.
because you're going to have differences between people who say, "This is what my politics are like, but I don't think that that should be the mission of the church."
Yeah.
and people who will say, if you're not addressing this list of political issues and with intensity, that means that you're a sellout. I mean, those people, even if they have the exact same list of beliefs politically, and even if they vote exactly the same way, they're also in a point of tension.
Right. Okay, so we're headed into a political season. And at this point, we also know some things. We know it's going to be Biden versus Trump. It's going to be the same cast of characters. And we know something about the plot because we've been here before. We're replaying 2020, but probably in a later part of the story where the emotions and animosities are even heightened even more. So as we go into this, next replay, almost feels like a rewind, feels like a horrific rewind that we're caught in here. Um, let's try to benefit from that reality. Like, let's view 2020 as game tape, Russell, that we can review and say, okay, how can we run things a little differently? What different plays can we run so we have a better outcome? Let's rewind and I want you to like break down the game tape. What can we do differently in 2024 that we did compared to 2020? What are mistakes to avoid? What are the opportunities to seize?
Well, what I would say first of all is I don't agree that we're facing a replay of 2020.
Okay.
Instead, I think what we're facing in 2024 is something we don't actually understand yet and
Okay.
will be quite different. And there are a number of reasons why that's different.
Okay, start there before we go into the game tape. Break that down. What's different about 2024 you think compared to 2020?
Well, if you look at 2020, I mean, imagine if we were having this conversation in, New Year's Day of 2020,
Yeah.
and we were to say, okay, let's rewind the tape to 2016 and figure out what this election year is going to be like. Some things would have been consistent, but we would have had no idea
That's
that we
true.
would be facing a global pandemic.
Yes,
We had no idea that we would be facing questions about candidates themselves getting COVID and what that would mean. We would not have seen January 6th
that's right.
coming. I mean, there's so many different things that are completely unpredictable. So that's different. And then you add to it also the way that in 2016, particularly, and a little bit in 2020, there was still a sense of shock in many ways. And that's one of the reasons a lot of relationships fracture is people would say, I don't even feel like I know you anymore because I can't understand why you would support candidate A or why you won't support candidate B. We're at a point now where there are a lot of people who have become numb to all of that. Not
Mm.
just used to it, but numb to it.
It's part
So
of the
they're all
exhaustion, right, Russell? That people are shutting down.
well, part of it is that, but part of it is too, there's just so much
Yeah.
that no one can get a handle on it. So there are things that right now would have been front page headline for weeks in any previous year
Yeah.
that are just completely passed over altogether because there's just so much happening at any given time.
Yeah.
So that's very different. And I'm afraid that people who think, well, we're going into 2024, it's going to be just like 2020, don't really understand what it is that we're facing. It's different.
Okay, let's go down that road then. Given that 2024 is going to be different from 2020 and in unpredictable ways, then what do we do then? How do we, let's put it this way, how do we learn from 2020, not in order to prepare for exactly what we know we're going to face, but how we're going to face it? What lessons can we learn about the fact that if in anything, history tells us it's unpredictable. So how do
Mm.
we face the unpredictableness? What
Well,
can we learn about there?
I mean, I think one thing is we have to keep in mind the stakes when it comes to, for instance, political violence. That's a subject that we would have never seriously contemplated in American life during an election. I mean, with the exception of 1968, in which we had, just a few years after the assassination of President Kennedy, the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and then a few years later, the attempted assassination of George Wallace. I mean, those things have never been quite as present
Yeah.
as a possibility as what we face right now. And that means that the stakes are not just about are people going to disagree with one another and our relationships going to fracture, but whether there might be actual bloodshed. And that's a different sort of reality.
Well, it seems like that has an implication for the message that pastors and the influence that pastors are to bring onto their congregation. So I think you and I both agree it's probably not a great idea for a pastor to be advocating for a particular candidate.
Right.
But I think what you are saying is given the threat, very real threat of political violence, and I've gotten briefings from like security officials who are saying it is off the chart, that they are almost certain there will be political violence. The question is how much, how organized, what mass scale it'll be. So this is a real threat that we should be prepared for, and that pastors can weigh in and should weigh in on, regardless of their own personal, private partisan allegiances. Speak into that, Russell. What is the role of pastors in 2024 where we are facing the specter of political violence?
Well, I think one of the things is to get ahead of those things with the kind of spiritual formation that addresses what it means to demonstrate the character of Jesus. I mean, the danger here is that if there's some sort of political violence, the danger is whatever group is perpetuating that violence, their side, whatever side that is, will have the tendency to say, well, I don't necessarily agree with whatever this action is, but, and then have a list of how bad
Yeah.
the people. So you have to get ahead of that and and shape and form people with the word of God as much as you can so that they at least stop and hear themselves when they hear themselves start to say those things. In the same way that, for instance, teaching people that, hey, when you're starting to use certain metaphors
Mm,
about your political opponents, animals or demons or these inhuman sorts of categories, those metaphors are really important biblically and also historically. And so for somebody to step back in and say, wait, I hear what I'm saying right now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that person is going to turn back, but it does mean that there's the opportunity for that person to turn back and to realize what's happening. So get ahead of it.
Russell, I really love what you're saying. It's so consistent with the big theme of our after party project, which is we're trying to move Christians towards paying attention to the how of politics. That so much of politics has been defined by the what of a specific outcome of a party winning, a position or policy getting passed, a what of a candidate sort of winning an election. We can be so fixated on the what of an outcome that we neglect the Jesus how of process, the Jesus of how do we engage in politics. And what you're talking about, Russell, is even the how we speak, the how we talk about politics and people really matters. It is formational to ourselves and to people around us. I want you to talk a little bit more for pastors about how they can actually emphasize the how. So one way you just talked about is by really disciplining ourselves and paying attention to the how we talk the language. What are other hows, the hows of process that as pastors we really want to be attending to in these next months?
Well, I found it's helpful to start with small, seemingly more manageable situations and to demonstrate how to do that
Yeah,
in a way that takes into account the why and the how and not just the what,
yeah,
rather than starting with the big spectrum question of a national election
yeah,
or something like that. And I suppose that really has hit me for years when I was talking to, I was seeking advice from somebody who had been a counselor for years and years and years about somebody in my church that I was trying to help with a big set of problems. And he said to me, "I think you're starting too big. And
Mm,
when you're talking about this, you're talking about something that seems so impossible and unmanageable. If you'd start smaller with teaching this person how to, for instance, save part of his paycheck every week,
yeah,
that you can do that, and then the person learns the kind of skills that can then be applied to bigger and bigger and bigger things.
yeah.
And I think that's true here. If we can teach people how to, for instance, relate to one another in our families
Mm,
over political differences, then you learn the kinds of skills that you can later then apply
yeah.
elsewhere.
Yeah, I really love it. It's very consistent with Jesus because we know Jesus lived in a culture and moment of political violence. I mean,
Yeah,
the zealots versus the Roman regime. I mean, the tax collectors versus the Pharisees. There was violence in the air and about to erupt, a few years after Jesus's, very death.
Barabbas.
Yeah, that's right. He was predicting that and warning about the political violence that was going to engulf the state of Israel, trying to steer Israel away from that. And when what's really interesting is he starts also in his own way, small. He says, you know, be careful about what you say to another because you're committing murder when you say raka, when you say your enemy is an idiot, a fool, a moron. You're actually setting yourself by your very speech on a path toward murder. Or he says, pray for your enemies, right? Love your, and that's a way to actually orient your heart in a manageable way before you figure out some grand political scheme. Why don't you start with your own personal prayer life by praying for your enemies? It seems like those are some really great ways as pastors we can start small because it's what Jesus did, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and also, I mean, we have an understanding of, as Christians, of the use of language that is different from the outside world. In
Mm,
the beginning was the Word, and the Word was
right.
with God, and the Word was
Yeah.
God. And Jesus talks about how the words that we say transform and change the person that we are, both
Yeah.
in good directions and bad directions. And so that means it's something we need to take seriously. And then you add to it the way that we as Christians believe that we will give an account before God. That account is not just for what are the end results.
Yeah.
The scripture repeatedly says, "You cannot say, 'Let us do evil, that good may result.'" So it's not just the what you're trying to accomplish. It is the way that you're doing that that really matters. And that's difficult to see in a sort of very secularized or even in some ways paganized world that would say all that really matters is what you accomplish and
Mm,
however you get there. And sometimes that's framed in the sense of a really Darwinian view of the universe.
yeah.
Everybody is as character malformed as possible. And so if you're not as wicked as they are
Right.
in the way that
Right.
you do things,
Yeah.
then it means you're a chump.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a really stark form of social Darwinism that just doesn't line up with a Christian understanding of reality at all.
And what's so striking is how that is a bipartisan
Yeah,
sin. That both
yeah,
on the left and the right, we are slipping into this Nietzschean sense of power above all. And how do we achieve the outcome we want, even if it means smashing the opponent? So that is an important warning that as pastors who are called to form the hearts, not to win an outcome, but to actually form the hearts and character of our flock, we need to really attend to. So thank you, Russell, for that. And if you're listening to this, please remember you can put your questions in the Q&A function that's on the bottom of your screen. We're collecting these questions. We're going to answer this in the second half of this episode. And please, you can also remember to upvote particular questions if you really see another question that you're like, hey, I really want Russell to answer that. Russell, I have a question for you that is I'm asking you, uh, country doctor to America's pastor, to actually diagnose me or help me and help us. And let me set up the question this way. So the work project that we've been working on, the after party, is very clear, as I've said, about we are trying to move Christians towards a Jesus-centered how of politics. The after party is not telling people anything to do on the what of politics. We are
Mhm.
not telling people how to vote or what political position to take. We do not mention in our whole entire 6 session episode Donald Trump or Joe Biden once, other than Russell, I think you once said in the Trump era. I think we scoured the tape. That was the one mention we have of either figure.
So
I think
I
it's
was
even
the one that did
you were
it.
the one that blew it, Russell. But of course, you weren't even talking about him. You're just talking about the Trump era. So we're very clear. The after party curriculum itself is nonpartisan. We're not advocating for a what of politics. We're advocating for a Jesus how of politics. But at the same time, we're not saying that people shouldn't have a what or shouldn't care about a what. It's just that this is not the emphasis of the after party. You and I, separate from the after party, we do hold certain whats of beliefs.
Yeah.
And one of them is, I think people can very clearly, easily Google either of us and know on the what of this upcoming election. I think it's pretty fair to say you and I are not going to be voting for Donald J. Trump. So they know that. Again, we're not teaching that in the after party. We're not using the after party as a vehicle for that, but that is the truth. So, but I want you to actually turn this spiritual diagnosis on people like us. How might we be tempted to actually violate the Jesus how in our own what of opposing Donald Trump? Because, we are ourselves just as much in danger, I think, of the same uh, mis, mis, misformation that we are wary of on people who are supporting Trump. The people who are opposing Trump
Yeah.
are just as vulnerable. People like us. So turn the stethoscope on me and yourself, Russell. What do we need to be careful about here?
Well, we could easily do the very things that we've just been talking about, using, for instance, dehumanizing sorts of language
Yeah.
for people who disagree with us. And also, what we can do is to say, if you don't agree with me
Hmm.
on this, this means that we can't have a
Mm,
relationship.
yeah.
Rather than saying they're actually as important as these issues are, and I'm, as you know, very passionately concerned about these things. But if I start to adopt this sense that politics is the most important thing in my life,
Yeah.
then I'm going to start kind of dividing the sheep from the goats in my personal relationships on the basis of whether people share those concerns with me.
Yeah.
And so I think what Jesus is saying is uh, there are all kinds of good things that, if they're prioritized wrongly, become really bad things.
Yeah.
So you can, for instance, a family is a good thing.
Yeah.
Scripture teaches us. Jesus says if we put family first, then we've created an idol, and we actually are pursuing something bad. Same thing is true here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Politics is really important, and being citizens really important. American democracy really important. But if you lose your sense of priority, is who am I first?
Yeah.
And first, I'm united to Christ, part of the body of Christ, carrying the message that the apostles have handed down to us. If I lose that, then I'm going to degenerate. And one of the problems with that is that then it's not just that becomes an idolatry problem. It also that it is a disillusionment sort of problem, because you start to have this idea, I'm either going to be completely triumphant on the basis of whether my candidate or movement or whatever wins, or I'm going to be completely defeated. And that's not only not healthy for a person, it's not the way American democracy works.
Right. Right. Yeah. American democracy requires that we are used to losing because it's
Yeah.
designed such that no side always wins, so that we all feel like we can belong to one another because we're not going to get ultimately crushed. There's going to our turn will come some way if we can stick into the system and stick with each other as a country. Russell, as you're talking, it makes me think about what a gift it is. It could be. to have somebody in our lives that is going to vote differently than us. Because at one time it can seem like a curse. You're like, my uncle, my grandmother, my own parents are voting differently than me, and that can feel like a curse. Like that's awful. I wish that weren't the case. But what you're saying is if the ultimate actual danger here is idolatry, is putting politics above all else, then actually that can reframe that person as a gift to us because it means it's actually kind of a always present diagnosis and always present spiritual medical alert in the sense that if we can still relate to that loved one, that family member who votes differently than us, that's actually a good check. I haven't put politics above all else. I haven't made politics an idol. And so in this 2024, to cultivate our relationships in our family or our friend network with somebody who actually is voting differently is actually like a good spiritual health practice for us. If we can still do it, it means we haven't quite fallen into idolatry. Is that right, Russell? Is that a good
Well,
way to
it
think about it?
well, it can be
Yeah.
depending on how we're relating to that person.
Well, right,
So
right.
I think the healthiest way that that happens is when you have a relationship that isn't even addressing the political matter at all. That
Yeah,
doesn't mean these political matters aren't important.
yeah,
What it means is that that's not. So I think you can have a kind of person, for instance, who has relationships with people who vote differently, but that actually contributes to the quarrelsomeness and the idolatry of political realities, because that then just becomes an ongoing debate.
right.
There's a certain kind of person who actually gets a charge out
Yeah,
of that,
yeah,
rather than to say, "Wait a minute." And so I've had to say, in some situations in my life, "Look, you and I are never going to agree on this, and but my relationship with you is really important to me. And so can you just kind of bear with me,
yeah,
maybe as a weaker brother, and agree that we're just not going to address that."
yeah,
Because I mean, you're not going to decide those issues. What
right,
you and Uncle Frank, whoever wins or loses that argument, and nobody's going to, because you're
right.
just going to keep going. But even if you did, it's not going to change the external reality.
Yeah,
And so to say, you know what? I've got lots of people I can argue politics with. I really need an uncle.
that's
That
wonderful. Yeah.
matters to me, and we
Yeah,
need to
and
keep
can we go to a ball game together? That
right.
that's
Yeah.
really what we should be
Yeah.
doing, right?
Yeah.
No, that's great pastoral advice, Russell. Uh, well, give me another piece of pastoral advice. We've been talking about how Jesus emphasizes speech, how we talk. So you've given us really good advice. Like one of the ways we can do that is by speaking with people who are going to vote differently than us about completely other matters, about matters that actually are more important in life. Really, they're actually going to be more effective. How's our health? How's our relationships? How our kids are doing?
Mhm.
How am I worried about my job and things like that. So shifting the how we talk with political opponents away even from politics is actually a really healthy thing in 2024. Another form of spiritual speech is prayer. And Jesus again talks about like how do we pray and pray for your enemies. Give us some spiritual advice on that. Give me some spiritual advice because Russell, I need to be praying for my spiritual enemies. I need to pray for Donald Trump. Teach
Mhm.
me, how do I pray for Donald Trump?
Well, I think that the way that you pray for the people who are your opponents or your so-called enemies is to, at least in the time that you're praying, to take them out of the category of the role they play.
Mm,
And to see that person as a human being, and to pray for the same sorts of things that you would pray for other human beings, or for yourself,
mm,
when it comes to uh, good things happening. Not that you're praying, oh, I hope this person succeeds in what I consider to be bad things.
yeah,
You're saying, I want this person to flourish as a human being. And I think
yeah.
one of the ways that you can sort of diagnose your spiritual health here is there are times when we might pray, for instance, about a political opponent, help this person to see see the right thing to do. And then when that person does the right thing,
Yeah.
we can actually be disappointed. And so you can have, it's easy to have this sort of Jonah
Yeah,
viewpoint that he has with
that's right.
Nineveh.
Yeah, yeah,
That can happen. And so notice that in
yeah.
terms of the way that you're praying and responding to your prayers.
Okay, last question, Russell, before we move to Q&A. I want to talk about worship because that is actually the role of pastors to lead their people into worship, including collective worship. What should collective worship look like in 2024?
Well, I think in some ways, collective worship ought to look exactly the way that it always has, which is to say, we're teaching people to ascribe worth. If you take the word literally, we're ascribing worth to what's ultimate. And
Yes.
so the act of worship itself ought to be a reminder. Life is a vapor. Even the United States of America is a vapor. The arguments that we have right now are a vapor. There's something that is more ultimate than that.
Yeah.
And we remind ourselves that through psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. We remind ourselves that by reading scripture to one another. We remind ourselves that by coming to the Lord's table, and by that remembering the ultimate after party, the
Yes, that's right.
wedding supper.
That's what the after party means, right?
Right,
Yes,
right.
that's a
And so those are the things I think are important.
I love that. And yes, folks, by the way, that is the ultimate meaning of our project, the After Party. We are calling Christians to place their ultimate hopes, the hopes that can get misplaced on the worldly human politics, to the actual Jesus party, which is the wedding feast of the Lamb when Jesus returns to restore all things. And then one final word on worship. Russell and I have also been working on a project that is part of the After Party. We were just in Nashville together with a group of Christian songwriters and worship leaders called Porter's Gate, and they will be producing a worship album called Songs for the After Party, which is designed to actually give worship songs to our church in 2024 that do exactly what Russell was talking about, is lift our eyes to the ultimate, lift our eyes to the true after party to come, to call our hearts to be formed to be people of reconciliation and reunion. So stay tuned for that. We're going to have more to share about that. The after party is not just the video course, it is that, but it's also a book that will be coming out in April that's co-written by myself and Nancy French. And then will also be a worship album produced in partnership with Porter's Gate, all coming in mid-April around. And you're gonna, if you really want to get a first taste of the book and especially the worship album, pay attention to an event that we'll be talking about coming on April 19th, that Russell will be there along with David French and myself, a live event on April 19th in Washington, D.C., where you can get to experience the course, you can get a copy of the book, and you can hear in an evening concert the actual songs for the after party. So stay tuned at the end of our webinar here for information about how you can come be with us in person on April
Yeah.
19th.
And I'll tell you, Curtis, being a part of that process with songwriters, it's amazing to see people the way they were collaborating together, and you had people who were musically gifted and people who were not, like me, who
Like
were
us, me
like
too.
and so working together, it was really extraordinary and beautiful, and something I don't think I've ever seen anything like that before.
And also gave me a taste for why musical worship is going to be so important in 24. It
Yeah.
just lifts your hearts and spirits in a different plane, a different dimension than the world's politics. So I'm so looking forward to the songs for the after party. Stay tuned for that. Okay, let's get to questions. Here's the first question, which is a pairing of two questions. Let me read it. Um, uh, this is from Christian. I don't know if he's referring to his religious identity or that is his actual name, Christian, but he says, how might a church leader bring about these conversations about discipleship and politics to a church that otherwise might not be interested or seem like they believe they need this, or to a church that thinks, hey, the church shouldn't meddle with anything that even smells of political discourse. And then Bill writes a very similar question. Let me just read it. Bill says, I'm an elder at the church that was the focus of chapter 2 in Tim Alberta's recent book, where the pastors took a lot of heat for relatively casual comments that incensed the tribal right. Some on the elder board want to proactively address 2024 as you are doing, but the pastors, I think, are gun shy. What are your suggestions to get them to begin consider buying into this discussion, whether specifically using the after party material or not? So both of these questions are about like, what do you do with a church that's like gun shy, nervous, that wants to stay away from politics entirely?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I understand the being gun shy. I mean, I do understand that, but there's no safe refuge in American life right now.
Yeah.
And so, what happens is if you don't address these things, you end up addressing them in really bad kinds of ways.
Mm,
And so, we don't really have a choice as to whether we're going to address this or not. We just have a choice as to how we're going to address this or not. And so you, the, there are a lot of people who have actually surprised me by being willing to listen and respond, even if they don't completely agree with a direction. Um, I think you might be surprised by that. And I also think you might be surprised by the fact that just the fact that you're saying to your people, the same way we do with all kinds of sanctification issues, say, you might not think this is something that we ought to be addressing, but your spiritual condition really matters to me.
yeah.
And that's what we want to address. I
Yeah.
think that's important.
I mean, silence is an option, but it's not an option for spiritual formation because your people are being formed. You know, pastors, your people are being formed. They're being formed by social media, by Fox, by MSNBC. They're being formed. The question is, who is forming them? And
Yeah.
really, ultimately, is Jesus forming them? And our role as pastors is to bring Jesus as the central formation. So, in that sense, silence, I believe, is really not an option. Okay, Russell, here's another question from Britt. Britt writes, on having people in your life who vote differently, we have apparently in our congregation full conspiracy theorists in our circle. And past experiences show they get angry when they bring some crazy thing up and then simply asking them, are you sure that's true? They get angry. So do we just sit silently and let it pass when they bring up these crazy conspiracy theories? Russell, what do you do in that situation?
Well, it kind of depends on where and how they're bringing it up. So I don't. I think there are all kinds of things. For instance, people hold wacky views about all kinds of things.
Yeah,
That the way that it's addressed is not by confronting that
yeah,
directly. It's by helping people to see a bigger view of who they are, and a lot of times that corrects that. It's a different thing when those people are bringing those conspiracy theories, whatever they are, into a bigger picture and disrupting, for instance, the life of the church. I mean,
yeah.
for instance, this is something that has nothing to do with politics. Years ago, I had a man in a church that I served who believed that the King James version was the only inspired version in English, and that every other translation was a New Age sort of distortion. Didn't bother me at all because he didn't bring that into
Hmm.
the life of the congregation. It was his belief, and I think his belief is wrong, but it wasn't something I really needed to confront at that moment. It would have been a very different thing if he had been coming to people in the congregation and saying that NIV that you're reading is actually a demonic avatar. Then I would have had to come in and say no, we're not going to do that. A lot of times when it comes to conspiracy theories, I actually think the arguing about them and the truth of them isn't productive.
Yeah.
It is if you have somebody who's about to act on some sort of conspiracy theory in a negative way, then you have to. But otherwise, it usually makes the problem worse.
All right. We have a question from Boaz. How do you
Right?
address the Yeah, exactly. There you go. How do you address the ends justifies the means mentality that politics encourages. Where have you seen success in addressing this mentality?
Well, I mean, there are aspects of this that are sometimes difficult to kind of work through. This isn't one of them because the New Testament speaks to that constantly. You cannot do evil that good may result. And so part of it is just informing people and shaping and then in many cases reminding people that that's the case. That external conformity is not the goal. It's conformity to Christ.
Mhm.
And so that requires basic Bible teaching and discipleship.
And I think one of the things you can do is to always help people relocate that mentality in another part of their life, especially a personal part
Yeah.
of their life, to show how that's untenable, right? To say, okay, what it would be like for you to use the ends justifies the means in your marriage or in your
Right.
parenting. What would that look like? What would that feel like to say to your wife, I'm going to actually lie to you because I need you to get to, do this X thing. I need you to make the bed the right way. I need you to, something. It's like we would never do that. Why would we do that in another sphere of life then?
Yeah.
Um, okay, I have this one I want to answer, Russell. Kevin writes, in what ways have you been encouraged by the response to the After Park curriculum so far? And has the feedback unearthed anything that you wish you had added or removed? Anything you would edit based on feedback? Well, answer it backwards. I'd have more Russell Moore and less Curtis Chang.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
our test audience shows they're like, yeah, that was good, but I want more Russell, more
Yeah.
sound, more cowbell. Um, um, but no, Kevin, I've been super encouraged by the response to the after party curriculum. I've had many people come up to me and say, "This is what we've been waiting for. Thank you for giving me a play to run." I think it's been encouraging to me to see that it's not, when we talk about this comparison of back to 2020 to 2020, one of the things in 2020 was again just how muted the response was in the Christian circles in terms of a healthy voice on Christian politics. And what I walked away from 2020 was I don't think it's because of lack of desire or will. It's not that pastors are derelict in their responsibility. It's just they don't have a play to run, because if they run the standard play of preaching a sermon on Sunday morning, that's for most congregations is the wrong play to run. It's one to many communication that's going to be misunderstood, and so it's like we don't have a play to run. And I've had so many pastors say, "Oh, this play I can run. I can actually bring the after party curriculum into my small groups, or I can actually lead my elders in this and start where it gives them a place to start." And I think that's been the most encouraging thing, is that the hypothesis that we had is that we just need to give them a play to run has borne out, and people are starting to run the play, and people are starting to find it helpful. So that's been encouraging. Russell, anything from you on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the messages that you and I and David have all received will be from people who will say, "I went through the after party because I wanted to find out how to make it through
Yeah,
2024, and through it realized I'm actually learning how to love people."
yeah.
I'm learning some spiritual practices and disciplines that actually apply to things way outside of
Oh yeah, that's right.
2024 election year, and that's been encouraging.
I think that's such a great insight, Russell, because you know, how do we remain in relationship to people we disagree with? How do we actually love them, pray for them, speak well to them? If you are married, that is a basic skill you will be
Yeah,
practicing weekly.
right.
Because trust me, you and your spouse will not agree on everything, on things that actually are more directly relevant to your life than what Trump or Biden can do in your life. And,
Right.
and so if you don't know how to actually love and be in relationship with people who disagree with you on very important matters, you're not gonna do well in your life. By the way, you're gonna experience this with your kids as well in spades, also. So in all of your intimate relationships, how do you love and relate across differences is a fundamental life skill. And actually, if you can do it in politics, that's actually a good practice grounds for you to
Yeah.
develop some of these very basic skills. Um, okay, I have a question from Michael Russell. What are your personal favorite direct quotes from Jesus that can help us survive or even thrive as disciples in this or any election season? So, personal direct quotes from Jesus, Russell.
Fear not, little flock, for it is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom.
Hmm.
And every part of that's important. Don't be afraid. You're a little flock. You're not coming with the same kind of power as the outside world. And ultimately, uh, you win if you're in Christ in the
Yeah.
things that matter.
Yeah.
Even if you lose in the things that you don't, that would be one, and the other would be a warning in which Jesus says, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees and of,"
Yes. Yeah.
which is to say, you can become exactly what it is that you think you're opposing
Yeah.
in really subtle and invisible ways. And how do you avoid that? Jesus says, watch out, pay
Yeah.
attention,
Yeah.
listen.
And I think people don't recognize that warning, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or sometimes it's Pharisees and the Herodians. He's talking politics there. These are
Yeah.
political parties. The Pharisees need to be understood as a spirit religious slash political party that was trying to rally Israel for its version of Israel nationalism. It's the first version of Christian nationalism, right? To overthrow, use political power to overthrow your opponents. And the Herodians slash Sadducees were like, no, we want status quo. We want the political status quo. We're allied with Rome. And when Jesus says, beware the leaven of both of them, he's saying both parties, both sides of their version of right and left, their version of Jesus's version is going to be infected with the same temptation, the same spiritual leaven, which is this us versus them mentality, this temptation to violence, this sense of actually making lesser things ultimate. And so this is a has been from the very beginning a fully bipartisan temptation to make
And,
politics our god.
and he identifies what it's rooted in, which is fear.
Yeah,
In order to say, you're discussing the fact that you have no bread. Haven't you seen the way that I've provided for you? So
yeah,
there's a way that fear can lead us to reprioritize in ways that ultimately do us in.
yeah. All right. We have another question from Brit, either a different Brit or the same Brit having a second bite of the apple here. This is a really complicated question, but I think we're bringing it up. Britt says, so many of us really appreciate your leadership here. Thank you. Like, you're welcome, Britt. You said you're not mentioning Trump or Biden. Is your recommendation not to identify the blatant corruption of Trump, or can we nibble on the edges? Russell, what do we do? How do we, let's broaden out a little bit to be not just about Trump. How do we comment on the public behavior of our political leaders?
Well, as we said before, both of us have very strong views on this, and David French, who works with us, doesn't have really strong views.
No, he's a milk toast.
He's kind of, yeah, but no, he also has very strong views. Uh, but that's not what this project is not about. That this
Yeah,
project is about how, as you go about engaging important issues in your community, in your neighborhood, everywhere else, how do you keep your soul
yeah,
as
yeah,
you're doing that? So that's really what the project's about, and it doesn't mean that you don't speak up and advocate for the things that you think are important. I'm doing that
yeah,
every week on this. But what I want is the kind of church and the kind of country where people who completely disagree with me on
yeah,
that
yeah.
and I are both relating to one another in ways that are Christ-like and that are fit for American democracy.
Here's my thought on this, Britt, is one way is, again, just to reiterate what Russell's saying, we're distinguishing what we're saying here in this context from what the after party as a curriculum is doing. Okay. But now we're talking about as Russell and Curtis here outside of that context. I think it's really helpful to do it in a humanizing way that is not actually so completely othering, demonizing, dehumanizing the other, and to look for ways to talk about, in this particular case, corruption, as manifestations of what is in all of our hearts, including our own hearts, right? So, what's actually behind those behaviors? Are there ways in which, in some smaller ways, perhaps, or different ways, we are tended to not tell the truth? We are tended to actually seek our own benefit. We can be deniers of reality in our own ways, and I think look for ways to humanize the behavior that you are actually critiquing, and to look for ways to, with proper distinctions, to actually be able to sympathize, not in a way that justifies that behavior, just like you're not trying to justify your own behavior, but to humanize, to say, we're talking about the human condition here. We're talking about human sin. We're talking about human fallenness, the very humanity that Jesus died for, that Jesus died to redeem us. He died to redeem Donald Trump or Joe Biden, depending on who your particular public character that you're trying to comment on. And I think that's our job, is to actually call all of us to be part of that very human story, of which the hero is not any politician, but is the ultimate hero, Jesus Christ himself. All right. So with that, everyone, thank you so much for joining Russell and myself. Russell, thank you for sharing these great gems of wisdom with our audience. It's always great to be with you.
Well, you as well. And I'm looking forward to April the 19th.
We're going to have fun at the after party here. So everyone, listen, I want to remind you a couple things here. Please follow us on social. It's one of the best ways you can share what we're doing with people in your own networks. As Russell just said, please think about joining us on April 19th in Washington, D.C. for the big after party event. We'll put it in the chat, a link for you to actually register, or at least just find out more information about this live event, which is going to be a combination of a taste of the after party in the course, in which you can get to actually experience the course live with Russell, David, and myself as the instructors, playing our roles that you'll see there on that graphic as the exhausted, the cynic, and the combatant. You'll get a chance to get a book, the After Party book, which is coming out April 19th, co-written by Nancy French and myself. And stick around that evening for a concert for the Songs of the After Party with Porter's Gate. I want to remind you guys that the After Party course is available right now. It's available free, completely free, through the 2024 elections, designed for small groups, but it can also be done individually. And you know what? If you don't have time to review all 6 sessions, but you want to check it out for its suitability for your church, be on the lookout for a link to a very short 10-minute trailer that you can get basically the essence of it. Look for that in an email to come as a follow-up, as part of you being part of this webinar. And again, just details, registration links, all of that can be found in after-party.org.